Sir, there has been a misunderstanding. It was just a professional misunderstanding.
There is no misunderstanding, officer. I teach people like you how to identify prejudice. And today, you just failed the test.
The sun was relentless, baking the immaculate asphalt of the suburban street into a shimmering haze. It was the kind of Tuesday afternoon where the silence was only broken by the distant hum of a lawnmower or the cheerful chime of an ice cream truck. Officer Kyle Novak hated Tuesdays like this. They were quiet, stagnant, a breeding ground for the resentment that simmered just beneath the surface of his crisp blue uniform. At 36, he felt like he was watching the world from behind glass. He saw the sprawling colonial houses with their perfectly manicured lawns, the high-end European sedans parked in the driveways, and he felt a familiar, bitter knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't his world, but he was tasked with policing it, a guard at the gates of a paradise he would never enter. His patrol car idled, the air conditioning blasting a futile defense against the oppressive heat. That's when he saw it. A gleaming black Genesis G90. Its paint so deep it looked like liquid night, turned onto the street with the silent, effortless grace of a predator. The car itself was an intrusion, a piece of aggressive luxury that didn't belong amongst the family-friendly Volvos and Audis. But it wasn't the car that made Novak's hands tighten on the steering wheel. It was the fleeting glimpse of the man behind the wheel, a black man. A switch flipped in Novak's mind. The quiet boredom of the afternoon was instantly replaced by a jolt of adrenaline, a surge of purpose. All the pieces clicked into place in his biased calculus. Expensive car, exclusive neighborhood, black driver. The equation always equaled suspicion. He didn't need a broken taillight. He didn't need a moving violation. In his mind, the man's very presence was probable cause. He flicked on the lights, the silent red and blue strobes slashing violently across the peaceful, sun-drenched scenery. The Genesis pulled over immediately, its movements smooth and unhurried. There was no hesitation, no sign of panic. Novak took a deep, deliberate breath, letting the manufactured authority of the uniform settle over him like a suit of armor. He was in control here. He stepped out of the cruiser, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. He let the car door slam shut, an auditory assertion of his arrival. Each step he took on the pavement was heavy, intentional. He wasn't approaching a citizen, he was approaching a suspect. As he neared the driver's side window, it glided down with a faint electronic hum. The man inside turned to face him, and for a split second, Novak was thrown off balance. He had expected to see a rapper, an athlete, someone flashy and arrogant. Instead, he was met with an almost unnerving sense of calm. The man was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. A crisp white shirt collar framed a muted gray tie, knotted with precision. His skin was a deep, healthy brown. His hair was cut in a neat, sharp fade, and a meticulously trimmed beard defined his jawline. But it was his eyes that held Novak's attention. They were steady, intelligent, and held a cold, analytical stillness that seemed to see right through the uniform, the badge, and the bluster. Novak leaned down, resting a hand on his duty belt, a gesture he knew was intimidating. He let his eyes rake over the man, from the expensive suit to the polished leather interior of the car. The smell of rich leather and a subtle, clean cologne filled the air. Disgust and envy warred within him. "You get this car from somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with a carefully calibrated blend of accusation and sarcasm. It was a loaded question, a verbal trap designed to provoke, to establish dominance from the very first sentence. He wasn't asking for license and registration. He was asking for a justification of the man's existence in this place, in this car. The body cam on his chest was recording, a silent, impartial witness to the prejudice that was about to unfold under the harsh, unforgiving light of the afternoon sun. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply held Novak's gaze, his expression unreadable, letting the officer's ugly question hang in the hot, still air between them. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. For Officer Novak, silence from a subject was usually a sign of guilt or fear. a moment where they were scrambling to invent a plausible lie. But this was different. The man's silence wasn't born of fear, it was a deliberate, tactical choice. It was a void that amplified the absurdity of Novak's question, making it echo back at the officer himself. The man, Dr. Julian Hayes, was in complete control of the encounter before he had even spoken a single word. His composure was a weapon, and it was disarming Novak more effectively than any shouted protest could have. Finally, Hayes shifted, his movements economical and precise. There were no jerky, nervous gestures. He didn't flinch or look away. He simply reached for the latch, and the heavy door of the Genesis opened with a solid, satisfying thud. He swung his legs out, his polished dress shoes landing softly on the hot pavement. As he rose to his full height, Novak felt an involuntary flicker of intimidation. Hayes was tall, with the lean, composed posture of someone who was comfortable in his own skin, someone who was used to commanding respect without having to demand it. He closed the car door gently, the click of the latch a soft punctuation mark in the tense quiet. He faced Novak directly, his hands held loosely at his sides, open and visible. It was a textbook de-escalation posture, a non-verbal signal of non-aggression that was so perfectly executed, it looked rehearsed. "Good afternoon, officer," Hayes said. His voice was a deep, calm baritone, devoid of any anger or fear. It was the voice of a man stating a simple fact, not one responding to a baseless accusation. "Is there a problem?" The simple, direct question seemed to momentarily stun Novak. He had expected a defensive tirade, a stammered explanation, or an aggressive challenge. He had not expected this glacier-like calm. It forced him to provide a reason for the stop, a reason he knew he didn't have. "I asked you a question," Novak snapped, his voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. He was trying to regain the footing he had just lost. "This car, you just buy it?" He gestured vaguely at the Genesis, his hand looking clumsy and oafish next to the car's sleek lines. "I've owned it for 2 years," Hayes replied, his tone even. He made no extra movements. His eyes remained locked on Novak's, not in a challenging stare, but with a look of steady, unwavering observation. He was studying Novak, dissecting his every word, his every twitch. Novak scoffed, a short, ugly sound of disbelief. "2 years, huh? And what is it you do for a living that gets you a ride like this?" He crossed his arms over his chest, another textbook move of aggressive posturing. He was treating this man not as a citizen, but as a suspect in his own success. Instead of answering the invasive, irrelevant question, Hayes made a slow, deliberate motion toward his suit jacket. "Officer," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more measured. "You haven't stated a reason for this traffic stop. Am I being detained or am I free to go?" He used the precise legal language, the kind of phrasing that signals an awareness of rights, an understanding of procedure. This wasn't the response of a cornered criminal. It was the response of someone who knew the rulebook better than the man currently trying to enforce it. The body cam continued to record, capturing Hayes's impeccable suit, his calm demeanor, and his precise language. And it captured Officer Novak's growing frustration, the slight flush rising on his neck as he realized his simple, prejudice-fueled stop was quickly spiraling out of his control. He had expected to punch down, but he found himself facing someone who was, in every meaningful way, standing on higher ground. The sun beat down and the silence returned, heavier this time, charged with the dawning realization in Novak's mind that he had picked the wrong car, on the wrong street, on the wrong day. While Officer Novak was floundering externally, Dr. Julian Hayes was operating with the cool, detached precision of a surgeon. Outwardly, he was the picture of calm cooperation. Inwardly, his mind was a flurry of analysis, a rapid-fire assessment of the man standing before him. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was a field exercise, an unscheduled, real-world demonstration of the very subject he taught. He categorized Novak's actions with clinical accuracy. Marker 1, pretextual stop, no observable traffic violation. The initial justification for the interaction was based entirely on demographic and economic profiling. The car and the driver's race were the sole catalysts. Marker 2. Accusatory opening. The question, "You get this car from somewhere?" was not an inquiry. It was an indictment, designed to frame the subject as inherently criminal. Marker 3. Aggressive posturing. The hand on the duty belt, the puffed-out chest, the invasion of personal space, all textbook intimidation tactics meant to provoke a flight-or-fight response. Hayes felt a familiar, weary disappointment settle over him. He'd seen this 1,000 times before, in training videos, in role-playing scenarios with fresh-faced recruits at Quantico. He had taught classes on this. He had written papers on this. He had stood on stages and explained, in meticulous detail, how this exact chain of cognitive biases could lead a sworn officer of the law down a path of unconstitutional harassment and, in the worst cases, lethal violence. To see it playing out now, directed at him, felt both surreal and grimly predictable. He consciously controlled his own physiological responses. He kept his breathing slow and steady, preventing the natural spike of adrenaline from clouding his judgment. He kept his hands open and visible, not just for the officer's peace of mind, but to ensure the body cam recorded his non-threatening posture. Every action he took was deliberate, designed not only to ensure his own safety, but to create an irrefutable record of the officer's misconduct. He knew the body cam was the most important witness in this entire encounter, an unbiased eye that would capture Novak's tone, his words, and his lack of justification. Novak's latest question, "What is it you do for a living?" was another red flag. Marker 4. Unwarranted interrogation. The question had no bearing on any legitimate law enforcement function. It was a purity test, a demand for Hayes to justify his own prosperity to a man who had already decided he was unworthy of it. Hayes understood the psychology behind it. Novak didn't see a successful man. He saw an anomaly that needed to be explained away. In Novak's world, a black man in a car like this, in a neighborhood like this, had to be a drug dealer, a scammer, a fraud. The possibility of legitimate success was a cognitive dissonance he couldn't entertain. So Hayes didn't answer the question about his job. It was bait. Answering it would legitimize the officer's prejudice, drawing him into a debate about his own worthiness. Instead, he had pivoted back to procedure, to the law. "Am I being detained?" It was a verbal chess move, shifting the burden of justification back onto Novak. It forced the officer to either articulate a crime, which he couldn't do, or admit the stop had no legal basis. Hayes watched the flicker of confusion and anger in Novak's eyes. The officer was a poor tactician, ruled by emotion rather than protocol. He was telegraphing his every move, and Hayes, the seasoned instructor, was reading him like a book. He felt no anger, only a profound sense of professional obligation. He had a duty to remain calm, a duty to follow his training, and a duty to ensure that this officer's actions were documented so that accountability, the final crucial lesson in all of his courses, could be properly administered. The encounter was no longer a personal affront. It was a pop quiz, and Officer Kyle Novak was failing spectacularly. Officer Novak was cornered by Hayes's question. "Am I being detained?" The legalistic phrase hung in the air, a challenge he wasn't prepared to meet. He couldn't articulate a crime because there wasn't one. Releasing Hayes now would be an admission of defeat, an unacceptable blow to his fragile ego. So he fell back on the one piece of protocol he felt was unassailable, the universal demand of every traffic stop, legitimate or not. "Let me see your license, registration, and proof of insurance," he commanded, his voice tight. It was a retreat, a way to buy time and reestablish a semblance of control. The request itself was standard, but his tone was anything but. He made it sound like a demand for a confession. Dr. Hayes gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. This, at least, was a procedural request he could comply with. He turned back toward his car, announcing his actions clearly and calmly for the benefit of both the officer and the body cam. I'm going to reach into the glove compartment for my vehicle registration and insurance. Then I will retrieve my wallet from my jacket pocket. His movements were smooth and unhurried. He opened the passenger door, leaned in, and retrieved a leather-bound portfolio from the glove box. He opened it, revealing the neat slips of paper inside. Then, he straightened up, reached inside his suit jacket, and produced a slim, elegant leather wallet. There was no fumbling, no frantic searching. Every action was precise, reinforcing the image of a man who was organized, methodical, and completely unintimidated. He handed the documents to Novak. The insurance card and registration were for the Genesis G90, registered to one Dr. Julian Hayes at an address just 3 blocks away. Novak glanced at them, his eyes narrowed, almost disappointed that they were in perfect order. Then Hayes presented his driver's license. Novak took the small piece of plastic as if it were contaminated. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, angling it in the sun. The hologram of the state seal shimmered. The photo was a perfect match. The same calm, intelligent eyes, the same neat beard. The name read, Julian C. Hayes. The address matched the registration. Everything was flawless. But for Novak, this perfection was just another source of suspicion. He ran his thumb over the surface, feeling for the telltale raised edges of a fake ID. He tilted it back and forth, scrutinizing the microprinting. It was an elaborate piece of theater, a performance of due diligence meant to convey that he was a sharp, experienced officer who couldn't be easily fooled. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to find a flaw, any tiny crack in Hayes's formidable armor of legitimacy. Dr. Julian Hayes, Novak read aloud, his voice dripping with condescending disbelief. What are you a doctor of? Spinning records? The attempted joke fell flat, a pathetic, unprofessional jab that only highlighted his own insecurity. Hayes's expression didn't change. He didn't rise to the bait. My doctorate is in criminology and social psychology, Hayes stated simply, his voice level. My research focuses on bias in policing and de-escalation tactics. The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. For a moment, Novak's smug expression faltered. It was as if a character in a play had suddenly revealed he was the author. The officer was holding the credentials of a man who was not just a citizen, but an expert in the very field where Novak was currently demonstrating a stunning lack of competence. He stared at the license again, as if the plastic card could offer him some explanation, some way out of the hole he was digging for himself. He found nothing. There was no escape. The name was there, the photo was there, and the man to whom they belonged was standing right in front of him, a living, breathing critique of his every action. The first test, the simple verification of identity, had been passed by Hayes with ease, but in the process, it had revealed Novak's own profound failings. The information about Hayes's doctorate should have been a stop sign, a blaring red light signaling to Officer Novak that he was catastrophically out of his depth. A reasonable officer would have paused, reassessed, and likely ended the encounter with a mumbled apology. But Novak was not a reasonable officer. His ego, bruised and battered by Hayes's composure and credentials, refused to accept defeat. The fact that Hayes was an expert in bias only felt like a personal attack, a deliberate mockery of his authority. In his warped perception, Hayes's expertise was not a sign of legitimacy, but the mark of a clever, arrogant criminal who got off on taunting cops. He had to regain control. He had to escalate. He needed to put Hayes on the defensive, to remind him who had the badge and the gun. All right, Doctor, Novak said, drawing the title out with venomous sarcasm. I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and place your hands on the hood. It was a completely unjustified command. There was no threat, no indication of a weapon, no reason to treat Hayes like a common felon. It was a pure power play, a physical assertion of dominance designed to humiliate. He was turning a baseless traffic stop into a full-blown detention. Dr. Hayes's calm exterior finally showed the faintest crack. It wasn't fear or anger, but a flicker of profound disappointment in his eyes. He knew exactly what this was. He had taught this scenario. It was called contempt of cop. the unofficial crime of failing to show the expected level of deference. Novak was punishing him for his composure, for his intelligence, for daring to be an accomplished black man in a nice car. "Officer, on what grounds am I being ordered to do that?" Hayes asked, his voice still steady but now carrying a new weight of seriousness. "You have my identification. My registration is valid and I have committed no crime. This is an unlawful order." He was again correct, legally and procedurally. But his correctness was like fuel on the fire of Novak's rage. "You'll do it because I said so," Novak barked, taking a half-step forward, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of his sidearm. The gesture was unmistakable. The encounter had now crossed a dangerous threshold. "Step away from the car. Hands on the hood. Now!" Hayes held Novak's gaze for a long second. His mind raced, calculating the odds. He could refuse. He would be within his rights. But refusing a direct order from an agitated armed officer was a high-risk gamble. Novak was emotionally compromised and looking for a reason to escalate further. A physical confrontation was exactly what the officer wanted, as it would allow him to retroactively justify the stop. Hayes's training and his instinct for self-preservation told him there was a smarter way. The body cam was his shield and his sword. It was capturing everything: Novak's illegal order, his aggressive posture, his hand on his weapon. The best course of action was to comply, to let Novak build the case against himself, brick by brick. With a slow, deliberate exhale, Hayes gave a single, sharp nod. "I am complying under duress," he stated, his voice clear and articulate for the camera's microphone. "I do not consent to this. I want my lawyer." He then turned, with the same measured grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and walked to the front of his car. The black paint of the hood was hot to the touch from the relentless sun. He placed his hands flat on the surface, fingers spread, and waited. He was now in a position of submission, yet he had never seemed more powerful. He had yielded physically, but had seized absolute moral and legal authority. Every second that passed with his hands on that car, under the watchful, unblinking eye of the body cam, was another second of damning evidence against the officer who stood behind him, fuming in the heat. An officer who had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Officer Novak felt a surge of triumphant satisfaction as he watched Hayes place his hands on the hood. For a fleeting moment, he had restored what he perceived as the natural order of things. He was the one in command, and the successful black man in the expensive suit was in a position of submission. But the victory was hollow, and it evaporated almost instantly. Hayes's words, "I am complying under duress," echoed in his ears. It was the careful, precise language of a man building a lawsuit. "Just going to run your information," Novak muttered, trying to sound procedural and detached, but his voice was strained. He walked back to his patrol car, still holding Hayes's license, and slid into the driver's seat, the superheated air of the cruiser a welcome relief from the tension outside. He keyed in the license number, his fingers tapping impatiently on the keyboard. He was hoping for something, anything, a forgotten parking ticket, a suspended license from another state, a warrant for a man with a similar name. The screen flashed back. Hayes, Julian C., valid, no warrants/wants. Clean. Of course it was clean. A wave of frustration washed over him. He was left with nothing. He had escalated the situation, put a man in a physically intimidating position, and had absolutely no legal foundation to stand on. He could either let Hayes go, a humiliating retreat, or he could double down. His pride, stubborn and toxic, chose the latter. He got out of the car and walked back toward Hayes, who hadn't moved an inch, his hands still flat on the hot hood. Novak's mind was a blank slate. He had no plan, no next step. He was improvising, and it was showing. "So, Dr. Hayes," Novak began, the sneer back in his voice. "This whole professor thing, it's a good story. You use it a lot?" Dr. Hayes remained silent for a moment, then he spoke, his voice calm and clear without turning his head. "Officer, I believe you are making a grave professional error. I would advise you to terminate this encounter immediately." The warning, delivered so calmly, was more infuriating to Novak than any threat. "Are you threatening me?" he spat. "I am advising you," Hayes corrected, his tone still even. "There's a difference." He then did something unexpected. He slowly, deliberately lifted his right hand from the hood. "Hey, hands where I can see them!" Novak shouted, his hand instinctively going to his weapon again. "My hand is in plain sight, officer," Hayes said, his voice never rising. He reached slowly, carefully, into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, the same one from which he had produced his wallet. His movements were broadcasted, telegraphed, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Novak watched, his heart pounding, a mix of fear and anticipation. What Hayes pulled out was not a weapon. It was a small black leather credential case. He didn't flip it open with a dramatic flourish. He simply placed it, closed, on the hood of the car next to his other hand. Then, using one finger, he slowly pushed it across the hot, polished surface until it was directly in front of Officer Novak. "You seem to be having trouble verifying my identity and my profession," Hayes said, his voice as cold and hard as steel. "Perhaps this will be sufficient for you." Novak stared at the credential case. The sun glinted off a small, embossed seal on the front. He recognized it instantly, a symbol he had been trained to respect above all others, a symbol that struck a primal fear into every local cop who ever dreamed of crossing a line. It was the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A wave of cold dread washed over Novak, a chilling counterpoint to the blistering heat of the day. He reached out with a hand that was suddenly trembling and flipped open the case. On one side was a photo ID of Dr. Julian Hayes, looking exactly as he did now. On the other side, emblazoned in gold, were the words that would haunt Novak for the rest of his life. Faculty Instructor, FBI Academy, Quantico, Virginia. The world seemed to stop for Kyle Novak. The distant sound of the lawnmower faded. The oppressive heat on his skin vanished. All that existed was the black leather case on the hood of the car and the gold lettering that burned itself into his retinas. FBI Academy, Quantico. The words were an indictment, a judgment, and a career-ending cataclysm all rolled into one. Every ounce of bravado, every bit of the smug authority he had wielded so carelessly evaporated in an instant, leaving him exposed and utterly terrified. His mind, which moments before had been a cauldron of suspicion and resentment, was now a vortex of pure, unadulterated panic. He wasn't just harassing a citizen anymore, he was illegally detaining a federal instructor. A man who didn't just know the law, he taught the law to the most elite law enforcement officers in the country. He had ordered a man who teaches federal use of force protocols to put his hands on the hood of a car. The sheer, monumental stupidity of his actions crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He looked up from the credentials to Dr. Hayes's face. Hayes had turned his head slightly and was watching him, his expression unchanged. That terrifying, analytical calm was still there, but now Novak understood it. It wasn't the calm of a man trying to avoid trouble. It was the calm of a man who was meticulously documenting every mistake Novak made. He was a scientist observing a specimen, and Novak was the rat in the maze, having just taken the poisoned cheese. Novak's hand, the one that had been hovering so confidently near his gun, began to shake. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor at first, but it grew until he was sure Hayes could see it. He snatched his hand away from his belt as if it were on fire. He felt a sudden, desperate need to appear non-threatening, to reverse the entire dynamic he had worked so hard to create. He stammered, the words catching in his throat. His voice, which had been a bark of command just moments ago, was now a weak, reedy thing. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. His brain was firing off a dozen panicked signals at once. Apologize. Back away. End this now. It's too late. You're finished. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. The quiet suburban street no longer felt like his kingdom. It felt like a witness box. The houses with their big, dark windows seemed like the eyes of a jury. The body cam on his chest, which he had seen as a tool to protect himself, now felt like a ticking time bomb, preserving his professional suicide in high-definition video and audio. He looked back at the credentials, then back at Hayes. The power dynamic hadn't just flipped, it had been annihilated. He was no longer a police officer detaining a suspect. He was a low-level functionary who had just committed a career-defining blunder in front of a senior member of the federal law enforcement community. He had challenged a king, armed with nothing but his own ignorance and prejudice. The silence that followed was the most excruciating of the entire encounter. It was Novak's silence now, the silence of a man who had been rendered utterly powerless by the truth. He had built a fortress of arrogance around himself, and Dr. Julian Hayes had just demolished it with a small piece of leather and a laminated card. The facade of his authority had crumbled to dust, leaving only a frightened, trembling man in a uniform that suddenly felt 2 sizes too big. The sun beat down on his head, and for the first time that day, Officer Novak began to sweat. The panic gripping Officer Novak finally broke through his paralysis, forcing him to speak. He had to say something, anything, to try and patch the gaping wound he had just torn in the fabric of his career. He needed to reframe the entire encounter, to paint his blatant prejudice as some kind of procedural normality. "Sir," he began, the word feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He had gone from doctor, used as a slur, to sir, as a plea in the span of 30 seconds. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." He gestured vaguely with his trembling hand, a nonsensical flapping motion. "We've had some reports of high-end vehicle thefts in the area. When I saw the car, I was just, doing my due diligence. It's just a professional misunderstanding." The excuse was pathetic, and he knew it the moment it left his lips. It was a lie, and a poorly constructed one at that. There had been no such reports. He hadn't run the license plate before initiating the stop, the first thing any officer would do if they genuinely suspected a car was stolen. He was inventing a pretext after the fact, a transparent attempt to cover his tracks. He hoped, prayed, that Dr. Hayes would be magnanimous, that he would accept the flimsy olive branch and allow him a graceful exit. Dr. Hayes slowly lifted his hands from the hood of the car. He didn't rub them or stretch his fingers. He simply brought them to his sides. He then reached out, picked up his credential case, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. The entire time, his eyes never left Novak's. He let the officer's pathetic excuse hang in the hot air for a few moments, letting its weakness and dishonesty be fully absorbed. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of the anger Novak expected. It was worse. It was the calm, dissecting voice of a teacher addressing a failing student. "Officer Novak," he said, using the officer's name for the first time, a clear indication that he had read it from his uniform. The personalization was chilling. There was no misunderstanding. A misunderstanding implies a misinterpretation of facts. There were no facts here. There was only your assumption. He took a step forward, not an aggressive step, but one that closed the distance just enough to make the conversation feel intensely personal. Novak instinctively took a step back. "Let me be very clear about what happened here," Hayes continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational yet utterly commanding tone. "You saw a black man in a car you felt he shouldn't be driving, in a neighborhood you felt he didn't belong in. You initiated a stop without probable cause. You used accusatory language from your first sentence. You ignored my valid credentials. You issued an unlawful order for me to exit my vehicle and place my hands on the hood. You did all of this not based on any suspected crime, but on the color of my skin. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a textbook case of implicit bias manifesting as actionable prejudice." He paused, letting the clinical, brutal accuracy of his assessment sink in. Novak could only stare, his mouth slightly agape. Hayes had just narrated the last 10 minutes of his life with more clarity than he himself possessed. Then came the final, devastating sentence. "I teach men like you how to recognize and override these exact impulses," Hayes said, his voice cold and final. "I teach them about professionalism, procedure, and the Constitution. And today, Officer Novak, you just failed the test." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the quiet, unshakable finality of a verdict. It wasn't an insult. It was a professional evaluation. And it was the most damning indictment Kyle Novak had ever received. He had been weighed, measured, and found wanting, not by a suspect, but by the very standard he was sworn to uphold. The devastating finality of Dr. Hayes's words hung in the air, a sentence passed and executed on the sun-scorched street. For Officer Novak, the world had shrunk to the few feet of asphalt between him and the man he had wronged. But the world was, in fact, beginning to widen. The small, self-contained drama was starting to attract an audience. It started with a curtain twitching in the window of the house directly across the street. Then, a front door opened with a soft creak. Mrs. Gable, a retiree who spent her afternoons gardening, stepped onto her porch, ostensibly to inspect her prize-winning roses, but her gaze was fixed on the scene unfolding by the curb. She had seen the black Genesis countless times. She knew it belonged to the quiet, distinguished professor who lived down the block. She had waved to him just last week. Seeing him with his hands on the hood of his own car, with a police officer standing over him, set off alarms in her mind. A few houses down, a man washing his SUV in his driveway paused, the soapy water dripping from his sponge forgotten. He leaned against the side of his vehicle, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. He, too, recognized Dr. Hayes. He knew him as a good neighbor, the kind of person who always brought his trash cans in promptly and gave a friendly nod. The sight was jarring, incongruous with the peaceful rhythm of their community. The encounter had gone on just long enough to transition from a routine traffic stop into a neighborhood event. The flashing lights of Novak's cruiser, though silent, were a beacon, drawing eyes and attention. These neighbors were becoming a silent jury. They didn't know the details, they couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but they could see the visual language of the scene. They saw a well-dressed, familiar neighbor being treated like a criminal by an aggressive-looking police officer. They saw the tension in Novak's posture and the impossible calm in Dr. Hayes. Novak became acutely aware of the eyes on him. He felt their collective gaze like a physical weight. Just moments ago, he had felt powerful, in control, the sole arbiter of justice on this quiet street. Now, he felt like an intruder, an unwelcome disruption. The very community he was supposed to be protecting was now watching him with suspicion and disapproval. His authority was not just being challenged by Dr. Hayes, it was being silently questioned by the entire neighborhood. Dr. Hayes, on the other hand, seemed to draw a quiet strength from their presence. He knew these people. They were his neighbors. Their presence transformed the encounter from a one-on-one confrontation in an isolated bubble into a public event with witnesses. It added another layer of accountability, another set of eyes to corroborate what his body cam was already recording. He made a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in Mrs. Gable's direction, a small gesture of acknowledgement that she immediately returned. The dynamic had shifted completely. Novak was no longer the enforcer of the law. He was an outsider being judged by the residents of the community he had invaded. He had tried to isolate and intimidate one man, but in doing so, he had only managed to isolate himself. The silent, watchful presence of the neighbors served as a powerful reminder. This wasn't just Novak's street to patrol. It was Dr. Hayes's street. It was his home. And Novak, through his own prejudice and aggression, had made it abundantly clear that he was the one who didn't belong. Trapped between the cold, professional judgment of Dr. Hayes and the silent, judging eyes of the neighbors, Officer Novak's mind raced for an escape hatch. He was drowning, and he needed a lifeline. His brain, addled with panic, seized on one last, desperate idea: procedure. If he could wrap his actions in the cloak of official police work, maybe he could salvage a shred of dignity. He needed to create the illusion that he was still in control, that this was all part of a process. I still "I need to verify your credentials," he stammered, the words sounding weak and foolish even to his own ears. It was an absurd request. The FBI credentials were self-evidently authentic. To question them was an insult, but it was the only thing he could think of to do besides simply collapsing in a heap of shame. Dr. Hayes simply raised an eyebrow. "Be my guest, officer," he said, his voice laced with a cold, dry irony. He was giving Novak more rope, knowing full well the officer would use it to hang himself. Novak practically fled back to his cruiser, grateful for the temporary shield of tinted glass. His hands were shaking so badly he had trouble keying the radio. He took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is 4 Adam 30, he said, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "I need you to contact the FBI duty desk at the Washington field office. I need to verify credentials for a subject." He couldn't bring himself to say, "faculty instructor." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, calm and professional. 10-4, 4 Adam 30, stand by. The wait was agonizing. Each second felt like a minute. Through his windshield, he could see Dr. Hayes standing calmly by his car, a portrait of patience. He could see Mrs. Gable still on her porch. This wasn't just a verification, it was a public spectacle of his own making. He rested his forehead against the hot steering wheel, a wave of nausea rolling through him. What had he been thinking? How had a quiet Tuesday afternoon devolved into this career-ending nightmare? Finally, the radio crackled to life again. The dispatcher's voice was different this time. It had lost its bored, procedural tone and was replaced with one of genuine confusion and concern. 4 Adam 30, be advised, she said, her words slow and deliberate. "I spoke with the duty agent at WFO. They confirmed Dr. Julian Hayes is not only a current faculty instructor at Quantico, he is a senior instructor who leads the Bias and Ethical Policing Task Force. They are asking for your name, badge number, and the reason for your inquiry, as they have him listed as off-duty at his residence. Over." The confirmation was more damning than he could have ever imagined. Not just an instructor, a senior instructor, the head of the Bias and Ethical Policing Task Force. It was a detail so perfectly, so brutally ironic that it felt like a sick joke. He had, through sheer blind prejudice, managed to harass the nation's leading expert on not harassing people. His blood ran cold. The request for his name and badge number was not a formality. It meant a file was being opened. An official inquiry had been launched at the federal level before he had even written his own report. 4 Adam 30, copy that, Novak managed to choke out. His voice was a hoarse whisper. 4 Adam 30, WFO is asking if Dr. Hayes is in any danger or requires assistance, the dispatcher added, her tone now sharp with urgency. The question was the final humiliation. The FBI wasn't asking if Novak needed backup. They were asking if their senior instructor needed to be rescued from Novak. "Negative, dispatch," he said, the words tasting like ash. "The situation is secure. 4 Adam 30 clear." He dropped the radio as if it were burning hot. He had called for a lifeline and had instead received an anchor, pulling him down into the deepest, darkest waters of his own colossal failure. He now had to get out of the car and face the man he had wronged, armed with the humiliating official confirmation of his own idiocy. Stepping out of the patrol car was one of the hardest things Kyle Novak had ever had to do. The protective shell of the vehicle was gone, and he was once again exposed, standing on the hot asphalt under the full weight of his actions. The dispatcher's words echoed in his head. Senior instructor, Bias and Ethical Policing Task Force. He felt small, foolish, and utterly outmatched. He walked back towards Dr. Hayes, each step a monumental effort. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet the man's gaze. The short distance from his cruiser to the front of the Genesis felt like a mile-long walk of shame. He was aware of the neighbors watching, of the unblinking red light of his own body cam, of the profound, suffocating silence that had fallen over the street. He stopped a few feet from Hayes, finally forcing himself to look up. Hayes's expression was unchanged. There was no triumph, no smirk of victory, just the same steady, dispassionate observation. It was almost worse than anger. It felt like the look of a scientist examining a failed experiment. "Everything check out, officer?" Hayes asked, his voice even. The question was not a genuine inquiry. It was a final, quiet twist of the knife. Novak couldn't speak. He could only manage a jerky, pathetic nod. Words of apology formed in his mind, but they wouldn't come out. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I racially profiled you? Sorry I'm the living embodiment of everything you teach against." Every possible apology felt laughably inadequate. He handed Hayes's driver's license back. His hand was shaking so badly that the plastic card rattled against Hayes's steady fingers. Their hands brushed for a fraction of a second, and Novak flinched as if he'd received an electric shock. "Are we done here?" Hayes asked. It was the same question from before, but the context had been turned completely on its head. It was no longer a request from a citizen to a cop. It was a dismissal. "Yes," Novak croaked. You're free to go." The words, the official phrase he had used hundreds of times to exert his power, now sounded like a plea for Hayes to leave, to end his misery. Dr. Hayes gave a single, final nod. He didn't say thank you or I told you so. He didn't offer any parting words of condemnation or advice. His silence was the most powerful statement of all. He turned, walked back to the driver's side of his car with the same unhurried pace, and got in. The door closed with a soft, solid thud. The engine started with a low, powerful hum. Novak remained frozen in the street, a statue of humiliation. He watched as the Genesis pulled away from the curb, but it didn't speed off down the road. Instead, it signaled, and then turned. It turned directly into the driveway of the beautiful two-story brick colonial not 15 feet from where he was standing. The garage door rumbled open, and the car disappeared inside. The realization hit Novak with the force of a physical punch. This wasn't just Hayes's neighborhood, this was his house. He had harassed a man, illegally detained him, and accused him of not belonging, all while standing on his own front lawn. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of it all was crushing. The garage door closed, sealing Hayes away in the sanctuary of his home. Novak was left alone in the middle of the street. The neighbors started to retreat back into their homes, their silent judgment rendered. The show was over. He was standing there, exposed and defeated, with nothing but the flashing lights of his own patrol car to illuminate the wreckage of his afternoon and, likely, his career. The 15 feet from the curb to that driveway was the longest, most humiliating journey he had ever witnessed. 2 weeks later, the blistering heat of the street was replaced by the sterile, manufactured chill of an interrogation room. The room was beige, windowless, and utterly devoid of character. It was a place designed for accountability, and today, Kyle Novak was the one being held to account. He sat at a cheap metal table, the sleeves of his uniform feeling stiff and suffocating. Across from him sat two people from the Internal Affairs Division. Lieutenant Marks, a man with a tired, perpetually disappointed face, and Sergeant Diaz, a woman whose sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to miss nothing. The atmosphere was thick with a formal, bureaucratic tension that was somehow more unnerving than the street-level hostility he was used to. There was no shouting here, no threats, just the cold, methodical process of deconstruction. "Officer Novak," Lieutenant Marks began, his voice flat, "we're here to discuss the traffic stop you initiated on the afternoon of August 15th. We've reviewed your report. We've reviewed Dr. Hayes's official complaint to the department, as well as the complaint filed by the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility." Novak flinched at the mention of the FBI. He had hoped, foolishly, that it might have been handled with a simple dressing down. He had not anticipated a formal complaint from the Bureau itself. "In your report," Sergeant Diaz chimed in, picking up a folder but not opening it, "you state that you initiated the stop because the vehicle was driving in a manner inconsistent with the neighborhood. Can you please elaborate on what specific traffic violation you observed?" "It wasn't a specific violation," Novak mumbled, staring at the scarred surface of the table. "It was the way he was driving. slow, like he was casing the area. It was the same lie he had put in the report, and it sounded even weaker now under the fluorescent lights of this room. Casing the area, Diaz repeated, her voice neutral, but her skepticism was palpable. The vehicle was traveling at 22 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. And you were aware, were you not, that Dr. Hayes lives on that very street? I found that out later, yes, Novak admitted. Right, Mark said, leaning forward. Officer Novak, we're not going to waste time playing games. We have the body cam footage. We'd like to watch it with you. We find it often helps to refresh an officer's memory. Marks nodded to Diaz, who turned to a large monitor mounted on the wall. She tapped a key on a laptop, and the screen flickered to life. The footage began. Novak was forced to watch himself, a third-person observer to his own professional implosion. He saw the sun, heard the sound of his own car door slamming. He heard his own voice, dripping with sarcasm. You get this car from somewhere? He squirmed in his chair. Every word, every aggressive gesture was laid bare. He saw Hayes's impossible calm, his precise language. He saw himself ordering a senior FBI instructor to place his hands on the hood of his own car. He saw his own hand, trembling, as he took the federal credentials. He heard the dispatcher's voice, the brutal, humiliating confirmation from the FBI. He watched the Genesis pull into the driveway, a final, silent rebuke. When the video ended, the screen went black, but Novak's face was still reflected on the dark surface. He looked pale and sick. The footage is damning, Officer Novak, Lieutenant Marks said, his voice quiet but heavy. There is no moving violation. There is no probable cause. There is only a series of escalating, unprofessional, and unconstitutional actions on your part, seemingly motivated by nothing more than the driver's race. That's not true, Novak said, his voice rising in desperation. I was doing my job. No, Sergeant Diaz cut in, her voice sharp as glass. You were not. Dr. Hayes was. He was an expert observing a subject in the field, and you, Officer Novak, were the subject. The body cam, your own camera, captured 10 minutes of behavior that is a textbook example of everything we train our officers not to do. The question for us now is simple. What are we going to do about it? Novak looked from Diaz's hard stare to Marks's disappointed eyes and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his career as he knew it was over. The unblinking eye of the camera had been his judge, and the verdict was already in. The meeting with Internal Affairs ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, soul-crushing formality. Lieutenant Marks slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a notice of suspension pending a full termination hearing. Novak was to surrender his badge, his service weapon, and his police identification, effective immediately. He was no longer Officer Novak. He was just Kyle Novak, a civilian under investigation. He walked out of the precinct in a daze. The uniform he had worn with such pride now felt like a costume. He had to be escorted to his locker to collect his personal effects. A walker, as they called it, following his every move as if he were a common criminal. His colleagues, the men he had shared shift cars and stale coffee with, averted their eyes. Some offered a brief, awkward nod, but most pretended to be engrossed in paperwork. He was already a pariah, a ghost in the halls he used to patrol. The days that followed were a blur of empty, suffocating hours. He sat at home, the television droning on unheard, the silence of his small apartment a constant reminder of his new, jobless reality. He replayed the traffic stop over and over in his mind, but his thoughts were a toxic brew of self-pity and rage, not introspection. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was furious that he had been caught. In his mind, he was the victim. He had been tricked, set up by some slick, arrogant academic who knew how to play the system. He cursed Dr. Hayes, picturing him sitting in his big, fancy house, laughing at the local cop he had brought down. He conveniently ignored the fact that every action, every decision had been his own. His anger was a shield, protecting his fragile ego from the devastating truth that he had failed. He had failed his training, he had failed his oath, and he had failed the basic standards of decency. It was easier to blame Hayes's suit, his car, his calm, his very existence, than to confront the ugly prejudice festering within himself. This bias wasn't something he had been taught to have. It was something he had nurtured in the dark, quiet corners of his own resentment. It was born of envy for a world he couldn't access, a bitterness towards those who moved through it with an ease he had never known. Dr. Hayes had simply been the unfortunate soul who drove into the crosshairs of his deeply ingrained insecurities. His phone buzzed with calls from the police union representative, a man who spoke in tired, cynical tones about fighting this and procedural errors. But even the rep's voice lacked conviction. He'd seen the body cam footage. He knew the case was a loser. The union would go through the motions, but Novak was radioactive. He was a liability the department and the city could not afford. Days turned into a week. He stopped answering the phone. He let his stubble grow, the sharp lines of his uniform haircut softening into an unkempt mess. He would stare at himself in the mirror and see a stranger. The confident, authoritative police officer was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out man adrift in a sea of his own making. The suspension wasn't just a temporary removal from duty, it was the beginning of an erasure. He was being scrubbed from the system, a system he had once believed he was an essential part of. The cold reality was that he was not essential. He was disposable, and he had handed them the justification for his own disposal on a high-definition platter. For 3 weeks, the story of Officer Kyle Novak and Dr. Julian Hayes was a contained internal affair, a quiet drama playing out in the sanitized corridors of the police department and City Hall. Novak clung to a desperate, fading hope that it would stay that way. A suspension, a quiet termination, a story that never breached the precinct walls. That hope was obliterated on a Wednesday morning when an anonymous source, likely from within the city government, leaked the body cam footage to a national news organization. The video hit the internet like a lit match on dry tinder. Within hours, it was everywhere. It was the lead story on every major news network. Cable news channels played the 10-minute clip on a loop, with panels of experts dissecting every second. They broke it down frame by frame. Novak's initial baseless question, Hayes's unnerving calm, the illegal order to place his hands on the hood, the dramatic reveal of the FBI credentials, the humiliating confirmation from dispatch. The story had all the elements of a viral sensation, a clear hero, a clear villain, and a dramatic, satisfying power shift. Dr. Julian Hayes became an overnight icon of grace under pressure. His image, impeccably dressed, impossibly calm, intellectually superior, was a powerful symbol of resistance against systemic prejudice. He was lauded for his professionalism and his textbook execution of de-escalation in the face of blatant harassment. Kyle Novak, on the other hand, became the new face of American police misconduct. His sneering, aggressive demeanor, his transparently biased questioning, and his ultimate pathetic collapse made him a national object of scorn and ridicule. He was no longer just an officer who had made a mistake. He was a meme, a hashtag, a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. His face was plastered across social media, often next to Dr. Hayes's, the contrast a stark visual metaphor for prejudice versus professionalism. The firestorm was immediate and overwhelming. Protesters gathered outside his precinct, holding signs with his name and face on them. The mayor, who had been silent on the issue, was forced to hold a press conference, condemning Novak's actions in the strongest possible terms and promising swift and decisive action. The police chief, who had been overseeing the internal investigation, suddenly found himself under a national microscope, pressured to deliver a result that would satisfy an enraged public. For Novak, trapped in his apartment, it was like watching his own public execution. His name, once a source of pride, was now synonymous with racism and incompetence. He couldn't turn on the TV, open his laptop, or look at his phone without seeing his own disgraced face staring back at him. Threats and hateful messages flooded his social media profiles before he could delete them. Reporters camped outside his apartment building, shouting questions at his door. The local incident had metastasized into a national conversation about race, policing, and accountability. Kyle Novak was no longer just a suspended cop from a quiet suburb. He was a character in a much larger, ongoing American story. He had wanted to assert his power and authority on that sunny afternoon, to make one man feel small. Instead, he had made himself infamous, his failure broadcast to millions, a permanent digital monument to his own prejudice. The firestorm he had ignited was now burning down everything he had ever known. The official letter arrived on a Monday, a crisp white envelope delivered by certified mail. It felt heavier than it should. Inside, the language was cold, formal, and final. The termination hearing had been a formality, a foregone conclusion the moment the video went public. The police department of Maple Creek officially terminated the employment of Officer Kyle Novak for gross misconduct, violations of departmental policy, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Just like that, his 12-year career was over, reduced to a single paragraph on a piece of official letterhead. He let the paper slip from his fingers and flutter to the floor of his cluttered apartment. The room was stale with the smell of old coffee and regret. He looked around at the life he had built, the plaques from the police academy, the framed photo of him with his graduating class, the shadow box containing his badge. They were all relics now, artifacts from a life that no longer existed. The union had cut a deal to let him resign in lieu of termination to protect his pension, but it was a hollow victory. He was done. Branded, blacklisted, and unemployable in any law enforcement capacity ever again. His story was now a permanent stain, a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was 40 years old, and his life, as he knew it, was over. That same Monday, 500 miles away in Quantico, Virginia, the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Dr. Julian Hayes stood at a lectern in a state-of-the-art auditorium, looking out at a sea of new faces. They were young, eager, and radiated a nervous energy. This was the newest class of FBI recruits, the best and brightest from across the country, the future of federal law enforcement. He was dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, this one a charcoal gray. He commanded the room not with volume, but with presence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and carried to the back of the auditorium without effort. "Good morning," he began. "My name is Dr. Julian Hayes. Welcome to the FBI Academy. For the next 20 weeks, you will be pushed to your absolute limits, physically, mentally, and ethically. Our goal here is not simply to train you as agents, but to forge you into instruments of justice. And justice," he paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room, "is not a matter of instinct. It is a matter of discipline." He clicked a button, and the large screen behind him lit up. It was a simple title slide. Ethical Policing and Bias Recognition. Module 1. The Anatomy of a Pretextual Stop. He felt no sense of victory, no personal satisfaction in what had happened to Kyle Novak. There was only a profound and weary sense of purpose. Novak's failure was not something to be celebrated. It was a data point, a case study in a systemic problem that he had dedicated his life to fixing. The former officer was a symptom of a disease, and Hayes's job was to inoculate this next generation of leaders against it. As he began his lecture, his voice filled with passion and precision. Two careers that had intersected so violently on a summer afternoon diverged onto their final, inevitable paths. One man sat alone in a dark apartment, his career in ruins, a symbol of a broken past. The other stood on a brightly lit stage, shaping the future, a symbol of the constant, arduous, and necessary work of creating a more just world. The traffic stop was over, but the lesson had just begun. The climax of Dr. Hayes's bias recognition course came 6 weeks into the semester. By now, the recruits had studied the theory, read the academic papers, and debated the philosophical underpinnings of ethical policing. They had run through dozens of simulations. Today, he told them, they would be analyzing a real-world encounter. "What you are about to see," Dr. Hayes said, his tone somber, "is body camera footage from a traffic stop that occurred several months ago. It involves a local police officer and a civilian. I want you to watch not for the obvious mistakes, but for the small, incremental decisions that led to the ultimate breakdown of procedure. Watch the body language. Listen to the tone of voice. Identify the exact moments where bias supersedes training." He clicked the remote. The familiar sun-drenched street filled the screen. The recruits watched in silence as the scene they had only read about in the news played out before them. They saw Officer Novak's aggressive approach. They heard his accusatory question. They saw Dr. Hayes, their own professor, calm and composed in the face of escalating hostility. A low murmur went through the auditorium as the recruits recognized their instructor on the screen. They were no longer watching a detached case study. They were watching an assault on one of their own. The tension in the room became palpable. They watched as Novak ordered their professor to place his hands on the hood of the car. Several recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their own hands clenching into fists. Then came the moment with the FBI credentials. When the camera zoomed in on the familiar gold seal, a collective sharp intake of breath swept through the room. They watched Novak's face crumble, his authority evaporate. They heard the humiliating call to dispatch, confirming what everyone in the room now knew. The officer had profiled, harassed, and illegally detained one of the FBI's own senior instructors. When the video ended, Hayes turned the lights back up. The room was silent, the young faces before him a mixture of anger, shock, and dawning understanding. "Officer Kyle Novak was fired," Hayes said quietly. "His career is over. He has become, for better or worse, a permanent part of this curriculum, a lesson. But the lesson is not about him. It's about you." He walked to the edge of the stage, his gaze sweeping over the recruits. "Every single day of your career, you will be faced with choices. You will have power, and you will have a sidearm. But your most important weapon will be your judgment, your ability to see a human being, not a stereotype, your discipline to follow the facts, not your feelings." Officer Novak failed because his prejudice was stronger than his training. Your job, your absolute non-negotiable duty, is to ensure your training is always stronger than your prejudice. The image of Kyle Novak, standing alone and defeated in the middle of the street, lingered on the screen behind him. A ghost of policing past, a warning for its future. His greatest failure had been transformed into his only lasting legacy, a cautionary tale taught by the very man whose life he had so carelessly endangered. Dr. Hayes stood before the next generation, not as a victim, but as a teacher, using the scars of his own experience to forge better shields for them all. The hum of the auditorium's ventilation system was the only sound for a long moment after the video faded to black. The recruits sat in stunned silence, processing the raw, unfiltered reality of what they had just witnessed. Dr. Hayes let the silence linger, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The story of Kyle Novak was not just a lesson in what not to do, it was a deep, psychological portrait of how a man's insecurities can curdle into a weapon. What if Kyle Novak had simply taken a breath before stepping out of his cruiser that day? What if, instead of seeing a threat, he had seen a fellow citizen and allowed his training, not his envy, to guide his actions? Perhaps he would still have a career. Perhaps he would have gone home that night, eaten dinner, and complained about the quiet, boring day he'd had. A single, conscious choice to override a biased impulse could have altered the entire trajectory of his life. His downfall wasn't the result of one grand, evil decision, but 1,000 small, bitter resentments that he allowed to dictate one fatal action. He saw in Dr. Hayes not a person, but a symbol of the success and respect he felt he was denied, and he chose to attack the symbol rather than examine his own feelings of inadequacy. And what if Dr. Hayes had reacted differently? What if he had let the anger, the righteous indignation he was so entitled to feel, take over? If he had raised his voice, made a sudden movement, or met aggression with aggression, the narrative could have been tragically different. The body cam footage might have been used to justify a use of force, to paint him as an uncooperative subject. His survival and his ultimate vindication were forged in the crucible of his discipline. He protected himself not by fighting back, but by creating an unimpeachable record of his own composure and the officer's misconduct. It's a somber truth that for some, the burden of de-escalation falls unjustly on the victim, not the aggressor. The real tragedy of this encounter is that it never had to happen. It was a fire started by the small spark of one man's prejudice, fanned by the winds of his own insecurity. The lesson here, for all of us, is about the immense power of a single moment of choice. We all have biases. The question is whether we have the discipline and the integrity to recognize and control them, especially when we hold power over others. Accountability is not just about punishing the Kyle Novaks of the world after the fact. It's about creating a world where they are stopped, or better yet, stop themselves, before they can cause harm. What did you feel watching that officer's authority crumble in real time? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's composure completely turned the tables on an aggressor? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe in the power of accountability, make sure to like and subscribe.